long before the rise of Athens and Sparta, a powerful civilization ruled the Greek world. They built massive palaces of stone, commanded armies of bronze-clad warriors, and traded across the seas with kings and pharaohs. Yet, one day, they vanished. Their cities burned, their power collapsed, and history forgot their name for centuries. Who were they, and what terrible forces brought their empire to its knees? Tonight, we uncover the mysterious fall of Mycenae. The story begins more than 3,000 years ago in a world that feels both familiar and distant. It was a time before the classical Greece you may know from school, before the philosophers, the Parthenon, and the democracy of Athens. It was an earlier age, one wrapped in myth and legend, when warriors in shining bronze armor fought under banners of kings whose names echo faintly in ancient poems. The land of Greece at that time was not yet a single nation. Instead, it was a collection of small kingdoms scattered across hills and valleys, each with its own ruler, its own palace, its own gods and traditions. Among these kingdoms, one stood out above all the rest. Its walls were said to be so massive that people later believed only giants could have built them. Its warriors sailed across the Aegean Sea to conquer distant lands. Its kings grew rich from trade and tribute, building palaces filled with gold and treasures from faraway places. This was the world of Mycenae. The name comes from a city perched on a rocky hill in the northeastern Peloponnese, overlooking fertile plains that stretched to the sea. Archaeologists today call the entire culture of that age the Mycenaean civilization, because Mycenae was its beating heart. From roughly 1600 to 1100 BCE, the Mycenaeans dominated mainland Greece and even reached beyond it, leaving behind traces of power and wealth that still astonish us. But this story is not only about their rise, it is also about the mystery of their fall. Because one day, after centuries of glory, the palaces burned, the kings were gone, the people scattered, and for hundreds of years afterward, Greece fell into what historians call the Dark Age, a time when even writing disappeared. How could such a mighty civilization collapse so completely? That is the question that will guide us through this journey. Before we explore their downfall, we must first step into their world as it once was, to understand the people who built it and the lives they lived. Imagine approaching Mycenae as a traveler in its prime. The sun beats down on the hills, turning the stone walls a golden color. As you draw closer, you see the famous Lion Gate, a massive entrance flanked by two carved lions, their heads once made of glittering bronze. Beyond the gate lies the palace of the king, its walls painted with bright frescoes showing warriors, hunters, and chariots pulled by sleek horses. Servants hurry through the courtyards, carrying jars of oil and wine. Scribes sit in the shade with clay tablets, pressing symbols into the wet surface to record taxes and trade in a script called Linear B, the earliest form of Greek writing we know. The smell of cooking fires drifts from the lower town where ordinary people live in simple houses of mud, brick, and stone. Farmers lead donkeys loaded with grain toward the palace storehouses. Blacksmiths hammer out swords and spearheads in workshops that ring with the sound of metal on metal. In the distance, the hills are dotted with olive trees and grazing sheep, the lifeblood of the local economy. Life here is busy, ordered, and surprisingly connected to the wider world, because the Mycenaeans were not isolated. Their ships sailed far across the Mediterranean. In the ruins of Mycenae and other palaces like Pylos and Tiryns, archaeologists have found objects from Egypt, from the coast of Anatolia in modern Turkey, even from as far as Mesopotamia. Gold jewelry, glass beads, fine pottery, and exotic spices tell us that trade networks stretched across thousands of miles. The kings of Mycenae grew rich on this trade. They collected goods from farmers and merchants, stored them in palace warehouses, and redistributed them as payments to soldiers, craftsmen, and officials. This system gave them enormous power. They controlled the economy, the religion, the military, and the law. All at once, at the top, was the Wainax, the king, whose word was absolute. Below him were nobles, who governed local districts, priests who oversaw temples and sacrifices, and military leaders who commanded chariots and infantry. Scribes kept records on clay tablets, while artisans produced everything from fine pottery to weapons of war. Farmers, shepherds, and laborers formed the base of the system, their work feeding the whole kingdom. It was a world with clear order and hierarchy, but also one that depended on constant flow of goods, of labor, of loyalty to the palace. As long as the center held strong, the kingdom flourished. Religion played a central role in Mycenaean life. The gods they worshipped would later become famous in classical Greece. Zeus, Poseidon, Hera, and others appear already in the Linear B tablets. Offerings of grain, wine, and animals were made at shrines to keep the gods' favor. Some palaces even had special rooms for rituals, with frescoes showing processions of people carrying gifts to the altars. Yet this was not a peaceful land. The Mycenaeans were warriors. Their kings wore suits of bronze armor. Their graves, such as the famous shaft graves of Mycenae, were filled with weapons and gold masks hammered into the shape of human faces. One of these masks, discovered by archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann in the 19th century, was so striking he believed it belonged to Agamemnon, the legendary leader of the Greeks in the Trojan War. That identification was wrong by centuries, but it shows how deeply war and myth intertwine with this civilization. Chariots thundered across the plains. Spears and swords gleamed in the sun. Fortified walls encircled the palaces, suggesting constant fear of attack. The same kings who built storehouses and temples also commanded armies and planned campaigns. Some historians think the Mycenaeans may have fought each other almost as often as they fought outsiders. Rival kingdoms vying for dominance over the Greek world. And over all of this loomed the shadow of legend. Because when you hear names like Agamemnon, Menelaus, or Odysseus, you are hearing echoes of the Mycenaean age. The poet Homer, writing centuries later, based his epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, on memories of this world. In those stories, kings gather 1,000 ships to sail against Troy. Heroes clash beneath the walls of a mighty city, and gods themselves meddle in human affairs. We cannot know how much of Homer's tales are history and how much are myth. But we do know that behind the poetry lies the memory of a real civilization, one that rose to greatness before vanishing almost without a trace. Archaeology has given us glimpses of their lives, but it also shows us the mystery of their end. Across Greece, nearly every major palace, site Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, was destroyed around the same time. Roughly 1200 BCE, many were burned. Afterward, the palaces were not rebuilt. The art of writing disappeared. Population levels dropped. For centuries, Greece slipped into a dark age from which it would only emerge much later. Why did it happen? Some blame invaders sweeping in from abroad, perhaps the mysterious sea peoples who attacked Egypt and other Mediterranean lands around the same period. Others point to internal rebellion, as common people rose up against the palace elites. Still others suggest earthquakes, droughts, or plagues that shattered the system beyond repair. Perhaps it was all of these at once, a perfect storm of disasters, striking a civilization that had grown too complex, too dependent on fragile networks of trade and authority. Before we can answer that question, we need to know more about the people who lived through it, about their kings and queens, their warriors and builders, their hopes and fears, because a civilization is not just walls and weapons. It is human, lives woven together, and when it falls apart, it is those lives that feel the loss most deeply. In the next part of our story, we will meet the rulers of Mycenae, the kings whose power reached across the Aegean Sea, whose wealth filled the palaces with gold, and whose ambitions may have set the stage for both glory and destruction. As we turn to the rulers of Mycenae, we step deeper into a world where power was measured not only in gold or land, but in the loyalty of warriors and the whispers of the gods. These kings were called wainaks, a word carved into clay tablets, speaks of absolute authority. They were the heart of the palace system, the point where all trade, taxes, and military power converged. Imagine the throne room of a Mycenaean palace. The walls glow with bright paintings showing processions of warriors, hunting scenes, and spirals of red and blue patterns. In the center stands the throne itself, a simple stone seat, but elevated on a platform to set the ruler apart. A hearth burns in the middle of the hall, smoke curling upward toward a hole in the roof. Around the king gather his officials, his scribes with their tablets, his generals with their bronze armor clinking softly as they move. Every decision begins here. In the Megaron, the great hall at the heart of the palace, the kings claimed descent from heroic ancestors. In later Greek myths, these rulers became legends. The most famous of them all was Agamemnon, the king who, according to Homer, led the Greek armies to war against Troy. Whether Agamemnon was real or not, the myths preserve a memory of powerful warlords whose reach extended far beyond their palace walls. These kings were not isolated figures. They formed alliances, married into other royal families, and sometimes fought each other for supremacy. The Mycenaean world was a patchwork of kingdoms Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, Thebes, and others, each with its own palace center but connected by trade, diplomacy, and rivalry. Warriors played a central role in this society. Excavations at Mycenaean sites have uncovered graves filled with swords, daggers, shields, and suits of armor. One suit from Dendra in the Peloponnese consists of bronze plates that would have encased the wearer like a human tank. Chariots appear in both art and written records, suggesting that elite warriors thundered across battlefields in teams of horse-drawn speed and precision. To be a warrior in Mycenae was to hold honor, wealth, and power. The kings rewarded their fighters with land, slaves, and a share of the spoils from raids and wars. Songs and stories celebrated their deeds, weaving them into the fabric of legend. But this warrior culture carried dangers as well. Rivalries between kingdoms could flare into open conflict. The same ambition that built empires could also tear them apart. The myths hint at this darker side. Take the story of Agamemnon himself. After returning victorious from Troy, he was murdered according to legend by his own wife, Clytemnestra, in a tale of betrayal and revenge that haunted Greek drama for centuries. Whether the details are true or not, the story suggests that even the greatest kings lived under the shadow of violence and intrigue. Power in Mycenae rested on three pillars: control of land and agriculture, dominance in trade, and success in war. The kings supervised vast estates worked by farmers who paid taxes in grain, oil, and livestock. They directed trade networks that brought in copper from Cyprus, tin from distant lands, gold from Thrace, and luxury goods from Egypt and the Near East. And they led armies that could defend this wealth or seize more when opportunity arose. Religion reinforced their authority. The kings acted as intermediaries between people and gods, offering sacrifices to win divine favor. Some tablets mention gifts to deities like Poseidon, who seems to have held special importance in Mycenaean religion. When disasters struck, droughts, earthquakes, or enemy attacks, people might question whether the king had lost the god's support. A dangerous doubt in a world where power and piety intertwined. Life in the palace reflected this mixture of splendor and tension. Storerooms overflowed with jars of oil and wine. Workshops produced fine pottery, carved ivory, and weapons of war. Courtyards rang with the sound of feasts, music, and ritual processions. Yet the massive walls around these centers remind us that fear was never far away. Defense was always a priority. One of the most striking features of Mycenaean sites is the fortification walls. At Mycenae itself, the walls are made of huge blocks of stone fitted so tightly that later Greeks believed Cyclopes, the wine-eyed giants, must have built them. That is why they are still called Cyclopean walls today, passing through the Lion Gate into the heart of the city. Ancient travelers would have felt the weight of those stones pressing down, a visible symbol of power meant to impress outsiders and reassure the people within. The royal tombs add another layer to the story. In the 16th century BCE, long before the great palaces rose, Mycenaean elites were buried in deep shaft graves filled with gold masks, jewelry, and weapons. Later, rulers built tholos tombs, massive beehive-shaped chambers cut into hillsides and approached by long passageways of stone. The most famous, the so-called treasury of Atreus at Mycenae, has a doorway over 5 meters high leading into a soaring circular chamber. Standing inside, you can almost hear the echoes of ancient funeral songs as torches flickered against the stone. These burials show rulers who wanted to display wealth and power even in death. They also reveal connections to the wider Mediterranean world. Some grave goods come from as far away as Egypt and the Baltic, proof of trade routes stretching across seas and continents. The image that emerges is of a civilization both rich and restless, where kings built monuments to impress the living and honor the dead, where warriors sought glory in battle, and where palaces managed complex economies tying together farmers, craftsmen, traders, and priests. But power built on constant expansion carries risks. The system depended on steady flows of goods, labor, and military success. A bad harvest, a lost war, or a disrupted trade route could shake the foundations. When multiple crises struck at once, the entire structure might begin to crack. Hints of trouble appear even in the myths. Stories tell of rivalries between kings, of betrayals within royal families, of curses that brought down dynasties. Later, Greek writers looked back on the Age of Heroes as both glorious and tragic, a time when human ambition reached great heights, but often at terrible cost. As we leave the throne rooms and battlefields of the Mycenaean kings, the picture of their world grows clearer. It was a place of splendor and danger, of wealth and war, held together by rulers whose power reached from the walls of their palaces to the waves of the distant sea. Yet, already the seeds of decline may have been sown. For no empire lasts forever. The forces that raise kings to greatness can just as easily sweep them away. In the next part of our story, we will look beyond the kings themselves to the wider world of Mycenaean civilization at its peak, the merchants and craftsmen, the farmers and sailors, the networks of trade and culture that linked Greece to Egypt, Anatolia, and the Near East. Because, to understand how Mycenae fell, we must first see how far its reach once extended and how much it stood to lose when the storm finally came. As the power of the Mycenaean kings grew, so too did the reach of their civilization. This was not a world closed off by mountains and seas. It was a world tied together by trade routes that crossed the Aegean, reached into the eastern Mediterranean, and stretched even farther to lands whose names the Mycenaeans may have only heard in rumor. To walk through a Mycenaean palace at its height was to see the wealth of many nations gathered in one place, each item carrying a story of merchants, sailors, and distant shores. Let us step into this world of trade and culture during the Golden Age of Mycenae, roughly between 1400 and 1200 BCE, when the palaces flourished and the kings commanded not only armies, but also networks of exchange that carried goods and ideas across continents. The Mycenaeans were skilled sailors. Their ships, with long, narrow hulls and single rows of oars, could carry both warriors and cargo across the wind-dark sea, as Homer would later call it. On calm days, the sails caught the wind, while in battle or against a storm, the rowers bent their backs to the oars, driving the ships forward with human strength. These vessels linked the Greek mainland to the islands of the Aegean, to Crete in the south, to the coasts of Anatolia in the east, and beyond to Cyprus, Egypt, and the Levant. Archaeology tells us much about these connections. In the ruins of Mycenaean palaces, scholars have found pottery whose clay came from distant islands, beads made of Egyptian faience, amber from the Baltic far to the north, and tin from regions beyond the horizon of the known world. In return, the Mycenaeans exported oil, wine, textiles, and finely crafted pottery whose elegant designs spread across the Mediterranean. The palaces controlled this trade carefully. Scribes kept detailed records on clay tablets, listing shipments of grain, oil, and manufactured goods. The economy was centralized, almost bureaucratic, with the palace as the hub through which goods flowed in and out. Farmers delivered grain and livestock as taxes. Artisans in palace workshops turned raw materials into finished products, bronze weapons from copper and tin, fine cloth from wool, perfumed oils from olives and herbs. The palace then redistributed these goods to soldiers, officials, and traders, or stored them against times of scarcity. This system created wealth and stability, but it also tied the entire society to the fortunes of the palace elite. If the center failed, the whole web of exchange could unravel quickly. Yet during the Golden Age, the system seemed unshakable. The palaces rose in ever grander scale. At Pylos, on the western coast of the Peloponnese, the so-called Palace of Nestor contained dozens of rooms around a central courtyard, with storerooms filled with huge clay jars, each capable of holding hundreds of gallons of oil or wine. At Tiryns, near the coast, massive walls surrounded a palace complex whose megaron glittered with painted frescoes, showing warriors, processions, and mythical creatures. Mycenae itself, the richest of them all, expanded its fortifications, added new gates, and built ever more elaborate tombs for its kings. The artwork of this period reveals a society both wealthy and warlike. Frescoes show chariots racing across plains, soldiers marching in armor, hunters pursuing lions and boars, and ships sailing with rows of oars flashing in the sun. Yet there are also scenes of music and dance, of processions carrying offerings. 2 shrines of women in flowing robes attending rituals or feasts. The Mycenaean world was not only about war, it was also about religion, ceremony, and the display of power through art and architecture. One striking feature of Mycenaean art is the combination of local traditions with influences from abroad. Some motifs come from Minoan Crete, whose earlier civilization left behind the famous palace at Knossos, with its vibrant frescoes of dolphins, bowl leapers, and priestesses. Others reflect contact with Egypt and the Near East, where great kingdoms like the Hittites and the New Kingdom pharaohs ruled empires far larger than anything in Greece. The Mycenaeans borrowed ideas, adapted them, and created a style that was distinctly their own. Religion connected these worlds as well. The Linear B tablets mention offerings to gods whose names would later appear in Greek mythology: Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Athena, Artemis. Shrines within the palaces and on mountaintops suggest rituals linking the people to both sky and earth, to storms and harvests, to war and the sea. Some scholars think the Mycenaeans may have practiced forms of ancestor worship too, honoring the dead kings buried in their monumental tombs. Festivals likely marked the seasons, blending feasting, music, and sacrifice. The palaces stored huge quantities of grain and oil, not only for daily use, but for these events. When rulers displayed their wealth and generosity to reinforce loyalty among nobles and commoners alike. To share in a king's feast was to acknowledge his power and protection. Writing, though limited, also flourished in this period. The script, known as Linear B, recorded economic transactions rather than literature, but it shows a level of administrative complexity remarkable for its time. Thousands of tablets survive, baked hard when palaces burned, preserving lists of goods, workers, and offerings that give us a glimpse into the day-to-day workings of the kingdom. Through these records, we learn of shepherds tending flocks, counted by palace scribes, of women working in textile workshops producing fine cloth for trade, of chariots assigned to military commanders, of temples receiving grain and oil for the gods. It is a world where religion, economy, and warfare intertwined under the authority of the palace. The Mycenaean kings also looked outward in diplomacy as well as trade. Letters from other civilizations mention a people who may have been the Achaeans, a name later used by Homer for the Greeks at Troy. Some scholars think the Hittite archives in Anatolia refer to Mycenaean rulers as powerful lords across the sea, involved in both commerce and conflict along the western coast of Asia Minor. This brings us to the most famous connection of all, the legendary Trojan War. Whether or not it happened as Homer described, there likely were clashes between Greeks and the cities of Anatolia over trade routes, alliances, and control of the rich lands near the Dardanelles. Archaeology at Troy shows a city destroyed around 1200 BCE, roughly the same time many Mycenaean palaces fell. Coincidence or part of a larger pattern? Historians still debate the answer. For now, in our story, the point is this: the Mycenaeans were not isolated warriors on a remote peninsula. They were part of a vibrant, interconnected world of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange stretching from Mesopotamia to Egypt to the coasts of Italy and beyond. Their ships carried goods and ideas across the sea. Their palaces displayed wealth drawn from many lands. Their myths remembered journeys to places as far as the edges of the known world. Yet such connections carry risks as well as rewards. The more a society depends on trade networks, the more vulnerable it becomes when those networks falter. A drought in one region, a war in another. a wave of piracy along the sea routes. Any disruption can send shockwaves through the system. Some scholars suggest that near the end of the 13th century BCE, these trade routes began to suffer from increasing instability. The same period saw turmoil across the eastern Mediterranean, the fall of the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, attacks by the mysterious sea peoples on Egypt and coastal cities, movements of populations whose causes remain uncertain. If the Mycenae were linked to this larger world, then its crises would eventually reach them too. But before the storms came, there was a final flowering of Mycenaean culture, even as threats gathered beyond the horizon. The palaces built their grandest monuments, expanded their walls, and stored up wealth as if the Golden Age might last forever. At Mycenae itself, new fortifications enclosed the famous treasury of Atreus, the largest tholos tomb of them all, with its corbelled dome rising over 14 meters high, a masterpiece of Bronze Age engineering. In the countryside, farmers planted crops, shepherds grazed flocks, potters turned their wheels, and traders loaded ships for distant ports. Life went on as it had for centuries, the rhythms of agriculture and commerce giving no hint that an era was about to end. And so we leave the Mycenaean world at its height, a civilization of warriors and merchants, priests and scribes, kings and commoners, all bound together in a system that seemed as solid as the Cyclopean walls around their cities. Yet history teaches us that when a society reaches its peak, it often stands unknowingly on the edge of decline. The forces that will bring change are already moving, slow and unseen at first, then faster and more violent as the years pass. In the next part of our story, we will watch as the first shadows fall across this golden age, as signs of trouble appear in records and ruins, as earthquakes, raids, and internal strife begin to shake the foundations of Mycenaean power. Because no civilization, no matter how strong, can escape the turning of time. The days of endless sunlight over Mycenae were beginning to fade. At first, the changes were so small that few would have noticed them. A ship that failed to arrive on time, a trade caravan delayed by storms in the mountains, a minor rebellion in a distant village quickly crushed by the king's soldiers. Life went on as usual. The great palaces still shone with gold. The warriors still sharpened their bronze swords. The priests still lit their sacred fires. And yet, something in the air felt different, as though the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The archaeologists who uncovered the ruins of Mycenae centuries later would find more than broken walls and burned timbers. They would discover layers of history piled on top of each other like pages in a book. Buried beneath the floors of the grand palaces were signs of repairs, hasty rebuilding after some unknown disaster. Cracks in the walls, scorched stones, collapsed towers. The people of Mycenae had faced more than one crisis before the final fall came. It was as if the civilization had been dealt several blows over many decades, each one weakening it little by little until at last it could no longer stand. Some of those early disasters came from the earth itself. Greece is a land of mountains and restless ground. Earthquakes have always haunted this region, shaking cities apart without warning. One powerful quake might bring down the outer walls of a palace. Another could destroy storehouses filled with grain and oil. When those supplies vanished, so too did the stability of the kingdom. Hunger leads to anger. Anger leads to rebellion. Even the strongest king cannot fight the will of nature. But earthquakes were only part of the story. Other forces were stirring. Across the Mediterranean, far to the east, great empires like the Hittites were beginning to weaken. In Egypt, the pharaohs watched nervously as mysterious raiders attacked the coasts of Syria and Canaan. Trade routes that had linked the entire Bronze Age world for centuries were now in danger. Merchants whispered of ships disappearing at sea, of ports burned to the ground, of markets falling silent. For a civilization like Mycenae, built on trade and war, this was a warning sign that could not be ignored. Inside the walls of Mycenae itself, the kings faced growing troubles of their own. Running a palace-centered economy required constant control. Farmers brought their harvests to the palaces. Artisans delivered their goods to the palaces. The palaces stored everything in huge magazines and redistributed it according to the king's wishes. When times were good, this system worked beautifully. But when crops failed or trade slowed, the entire structure began to crack. People relied on the palace for food, for security, for order itself. If the palace failed, chaos followed. Evidence suggests that around this time, the once powerful kings may have begun losing their grip. In some cities, new fortifications were built as though they feared attacks from their neighbors. Why would a united kingdom need to defend itself against its own people? Perhaps rival lords were rising, challenging the old kings. Perhaps ordinary farmers and herders, tired of giving up their grain and livestock to the palace, began to resist. What had once been a shining center of power now looked more like a fortress preparing for siege. Religious life, too, shows signs of change. The Linear B tablets that record offerings to the gods reveal a growing sense of desperation. More sacrifices, more prayers, more pleas for protection. When people fear the future, they often turn to their gods with greater urgency. Yet even the temples could not stop what was coming. Some scholars believe climate change played a role. Drought may have struck parts of the eastern Mediterranean during these years. Without rain, crops failed. Without crops, famine spread. Hungry people do desperate things. They revolt. They migrate. They abandon cities that can no longer feed them. One by one, the pillars of Mycenaean society, trade, agriculture, royal authority, even religion, were being shaken. Then there were the fires. Across the ruins of many Mycenaean sites, archaeologists have found thick layers of ash dating to the same period. Whole palaces burned so fiercely that the stones themselves cracked from the heat. Was this the work of invaders, rebels, or simply accidents made worse by drought and unrest? No one can say for certain, but the image is clear. A land once filled with the sounds of feasting and music now echoed with the cries of war and destruction. By the late 13th century BCE, the Mycenaean world stood at a crossroads. Some cities had already fallen. Others struggled to hold on, rebuilding walls, repairing palaces, trying to keep the old ways alive. But the system that had supported Mycenaean power for centuries was unraveling. Trade routes lay in ruins. The great kingdoms of the Near East were collapsing one after another. And beyond the horizon, across the restless sea, a new and terrifying enemy was gathering strength. The kings of Mycenae could not have known it, but the end of their world was drawing near. When we look back now, it is easy to see the signs of decline. We have the ruins, the burned walls, the broken tablets, the scattered bones. But to the people living then, the fall must have come as a series of shocks, each one worse than the last. A bad harvest here, a rebellion there, a fleet of raiders appearing out of nowhere. Life goes on until suddenly it doesn't. That is how civilizations, and not always in a single moment of doom, but in a slow, uneven march toward collapse. And so Mycenae entered its final century, a time of fear and uncertainty. The kings still ruled from their hilltop palaces. The warriors still carried their spears and swords. The merchants still sailed the seas. But the shadows were lengthening. Over the land of Agamemnon, the glory of the Bronze Age was fading, and something far darker was about to take its place. Far across the Mediterranean, beyond the familiar trade routes and the friendly harbors, something was stirring. The ancient world spoke of them in whispers, never certain who they were or where they came from. The Egyptians would later call them the Sea Peoples. To the cities of the Near East, they were demons rising from the sea itself, raiders who struck without warning, burned everything in their path, and vanished before an army could catch them. No one knows exactly where the Sea Peoples originated. Some scholars believe they came from the islands of the Aegean, perhaps driven by hunger or war from their own homes. Others think they came from as far west as Sicily or Sardinia, a tide of desperate migrants moving east in search of land and food. Whatever their origin, what mattered to the people of Mycenae was what they did. They attacked, one by one. The coastal cities of the eastern Mediterranean fell before them. Ugarit, a rich trading city in modern Syria, sent desperate letters to its allies begging for help. The letters still survive, written on clay tablets. "The enemy ships are here," one king wrote. "They have set fire to my cities. My army is away. I am alone." Soon after, Ugarit disappeared from history. Egypt barely survived. The pharaoh Ramses III claimed victory over the Sea Peoples in a great battle fought on land and sea. Around 1177 BCE, his temples show images of the battle. Strange warriors with horned helmets, ships crashing together in the Nile Delta, Egyptian. Archers firing arrows into the chaos. Egypt called it a triumph. But even pharaohs could not stop the wave of destruction sweeping the world, and Mycenae lay directly in its path. For centuries, the kings of Mycenae had sent their ships far and wide. They traded for copper from Cyprus, tin from Anatolia, gold. From Egypt, their warriors sailed to Troy and beyond. They knew the sea as a source of wealth and power. Now it brought death to their door. Archaeologists have found signs of violent destruction across the Mycenaean world around this time. Cities burned, palaces collapsed, fortifications were smashed. It is tempting to imagine the Sea Peoples landing on Mycenaean shores, storming the walls, cutting down the defenders. Perhaps that is exactly what happened, perhaps not. Some scholars think the raiders passed by Greece on their way to richer lands in the east. Others believe Mycenae fought them off, but at great cost, draining its strength when it could least afford to. Either way, the effect was the same. Trade collapsed completely. No merchant ship was safe. The lifeblood of the Mycenaean economy dried up. Without trade, the palaces could not feed their people or pay their soldiers. Without soldiers, they could not protect the farms and villages from raids. Without food, rebellion and famine followed. Inside the walls of Mycenae, fear grew. The kings fortified their palaces like never before. Massive walls of stone, so huge that later Greeks would call them Cyclopean, as if only giants could have built them, rose around the cities. But walls alone cannot stop history. A fortress without allies, without food, without hope, becomes only a tomb waiting for its dead. Some stories from Greek legend may echo this time of chaos. Tales of wandering heroes, of cities betrayed from within, of kings murdered by rivals all, could reflect the real disasters tearing the Mycenaean world apart. Agamemnon, the king who led the Greeks to Troy, is said to have been killed by his own wife when he returned home. Was this myth born from memories of civil war and palace intrigue? As the old order crumbled, others speak of entire peoples on the move, refugees fleeing burned cities, looking for new homes, bands of warriors without masters, selling their swords to the highest bidder, farmers abandoning their fields as drought and raids made life impossible. The Bronze Age world had been tightly connected for centuries. Now those connections were unraveling in violence and flame. One by one, the great palaces of Greece fell silent. Pylos burned, Tiryns burned. The palace at Mycenae itself, the heart of the kingdom, suffered destruction from which it would never recover. Writing disappeared, no more linear B tablets after this time. The artisans who once filled storerooms with fine pottery and gold ornaments vanished. Trade routes lay in ruins. The world that had built Mycenae was gone. By the early 12th century BCE, Greece entered what later historians would call the Dark Age. Populations shrank. People lived in small villages rather than great cities. The art of writing was forgotten. For centuries, kings became chieftains. Monumental architecture ceased. It was as if someone had turned off the lights on the entire Aegean world. And yet, even in the darkness, memories lingered. The Greeks of later ages remembered a time when mighty kings ruled from golden palaces, when heroes sailed to Troy, when gods walked among men. They sang of Agamemnon, Achilles, Odysseus. Perhaps they did not know those songs came from the ruins of Mycenae, from a world destroyed by forces no one fully understood. What remains certain is this: the sea peoples were not the only cause of the collapse, but they were the storm that broke whatever was left standing. Mycenae fell, and with it the entire Bronze Age civilization of Greece. The age of kings ended. The age of legends began. The palaces were silent now. The golden masks of kings lay buried beneath rubble and ash. The storerooms stood empty, their jars shattered, their treasures looted or lost to fire. Across the hills and valleys of Greece, the mighty walls of Mycenae, Tiryns and Pylos, rose like broken teeth against the sky, grim reminders of a power that had vanished. The people who lived among those ruins must have wondered what had happened to their world. Their fathers and grandfathers had seen kings ride in chariots, armies march in shining armor, ships sail for distant shores. Now there were no armies, no ships, no kings. Life retreated to small villages of mud brick houses and thatched roofs. Farming became the center of survival. Trade dwindled to nothing. For centuries, writing disappeared entirely. No one carved records on clay tablets. No one kept palace archives. The knowledge of how to read and write simply died out. Historians call this period the Greek Dark Age. It lasted from about 1100 to 800 BCE, nearly 300 years when Greece left behind almost no written record. To later generations, it seemed as if a great curtain had fallen, hiding everything that came before. But the people did not forget. Even in the darkness, stories survived. Around the fires of small villages, bards sang of heroes and kings, of wars fought long ago, of gods who favored some men and cursed others. These stories changed with every telling, growing larger than life, embroidered with wonders and sorrows. Over time, the real kings of Mycenae became the legendary figures of Greek mythic Agamemnon, Achilles, Odysseus. Perhaps the people did not remember the details of palaces and trade routes. but they remembered the feeling of a world greater than their own, a world where human ambition reached for glory and met ruin. Archaeology shows us how hard life became after the fall. Population shrank drastically. Entire regions were abandoned. The art of building in stone disappeared. People lived in huts of wood and clay. Metalworking declined, then slowly shifted from bronze to iron, beginning the Iron Age. With trade networks gone, wealth concentrated in a few places or vanished altogether. Some communities moved to defensible hills, building small fortresses against raiders. Others turned inward, isolated by mountains and the sea. There were no more large kingdoms, no more centralized palaces. Power fragmented into tiny chiefdoms. Each village had its own leader, its own warriors, its own struggles for survival. And yet, the Dark Age was not completely empty. In some places, simple pottery replaced the elaborate Mycenaean designs, but patterns slowly returned over generations. New burial customs appeared, suggesting changes in religion or social structure. The Greeks began using iron tools and weapons, cheaper and harder than bronze, giving small communities the means to defend themselves and farm more effectively. Most importantly, the epic songs grew. Traveling poets, called oiadoi, wandered from village to village, singing of a time when men were greater than they were now. They told of Troy, of heroes who fought for honor and died young, of gods who toyed with human fate. These songs kept the memory of the Bronze Age alive, long after its palaces had crumbled to dust. One of those poets, centuries later, would shape the stories into the epics we know today as the Iliad and the Odyssey. His name was Homer, or perhaps that was the name given to a tradition of singers, whose words finally reached written form when Greece learned writing again around the 8th century BCE. By then, the Greek alphabet had arrived, adapted from the Phoenicians. With it, the songs of heroes were preserved on parchment and papyrus instead of vanishing into the night air after each performance. Through Homer, the memory of Mycenae lived on, though transformed into legend. But during the centuries, right after the collapse, people lived with loss. Imagine standing among the ruins of a palace whose walls still bore traces of fire, knowing your ancestors once ruled here, but you possessed nothing of their power or wealth. Imagine hearing an old man sing of kings who rode to Troy in chariots, of bronze while you held only an iron spear and wore no armor at all. The Dark Age shaped the Greek spirit in ways we still feel today. Out of hardship came resilience. Out of loss came the hunger for knowledge, for order, for meaning. When writing returned, when cities rose again, when philosophers later asked what it meant to be human in a world ruled by fate and chance, they carried the memory of centuries when civilization itself had nearly died. It is easy to think of history as progress, a steady climb from primitive beginnings to modern achievements. The story of Mycenae shows otherwise. Civilizations can fall. Knowledge can vanish. Whole systems of trade, art, and government can disappear almost overnight, leaving survivors to start again from nothing. And yet, even as darkness covered Greece, the seeds of the future were growing. Small villages would one day become city-states. Oral poetry would become literature. Local chieftains would give way to councils and assemblies. From the ruins of Mycenae's kings would rise the democracy of Athens, the philosophy of Plato, the theater of Sophocles, the conquests of Alexander. But that was centuries ahead. For now, the hills of Greece lay quiet under the sun. Among the ruins, shepherds grazed their flocks where kings once ruled. Farmers plowed fields beside toppled walls. Children played among stones carved by ancestors whose names they no longer knew. The world of Agamemnon and Achilles was gone. The age of myth had begun. Centuries passed. The Mycenaean palaces crumbled into dust. Their walls tumbled by time and forgotten by all but a few wandering shepherds. Generations lived and died above their buried ruins, unaware of the history beneath their feet. But the memory of the Bronze Age refused to disappear completely. It lingered in fragments of song, in strange mounds of earth where tombs lay hidden, in stories told by firesides about kings who fought at Troy and never came home. When Greece emerged from its dark age around 800 BCE, it entered a new era of city-states and colonies, of trade and philosophy, of art and politics. But even as Athens debated democracy and Sparta drilled soldiers, poets still sang of Agamemnon, Menelaus, Achilles, and Odysseus. To the Greeks of this later age, the Trojan War was already the distant past, half memory, half legend. The walls of Troy still stood in ruins on the coast of Anatolia, visited by travelers who wondered if Homer's heroes had truly fought there. But the palaces of Mycenae, the very heart of the old kings, lay hidden in the hills, their glory reduced to rumor and shadow. For over 2,000 years, no one knew the full story of the Mycenaeans. Medieval travelers stumbled across broken walls in Greece and guessed at their builders. Some thought giants had piled the stones. Since the blocks were so massive, no ordinary men could have lifted them. They called them Cyclopean walls, after the one-eyed giants of myth. Others imagined a race of ancient heroes, stronger and wiser than any living people, who vanished when the gods withdrew their favor. But the truth slept under layers of earth until the 19th century. It was then that a man named Heinrich Schliemann arrived, driven by dreams of Troy and Mycenae. Schliemann was no ordinary scholar. Born in Germany in 1822, he grew up obsessed with Homer's epics, convinced that the stories of the Iliad and Odyssey were not mere myths, but records of real places and events. Most academics dismissed this idea. To them, Homer's world was legend, not history. Schliemann disagreed. He believed that if the poems described cities, palaces, and kings in detail, those places must have existed somewhere, and he was determined to find them. After years of earning a fortune in business, Schliemann used his wealth to pursue archaeology, though in truth, his methods were closer to treasure hunting than modern science. He was impatient, dramatic, eager for discoveries that would prove him right. In 1870, he began excavating the mound at Hisarlik in modern Turkey, convinced it was ancient Troy. He uncovered layers of ruins, some older than Homer's time, some younger. Among them, he found walls, gates, weapons, and gold jewelry. Convinced he had found Priam's treasure, the king of Troy, in the Iliad, Schliemann declared Homer's stories confirmed by history. But Troy was only half the tale. In 1876, Schliemann turned to Greece itself. He came to the hill of Mycenae, where local villagers spoke of ancient walls and mysterious graves. Digging inside the citadel, he uncovered a series of shaft graves deep, pits lined with stone filled with gold, weapons, and masks. One mask in particular, a golden sheet hammered into the shape of a human face, struck him with awe. He believed it was the death mask of Agamemnon himself, the king who led the Greeks to Troy. Holding the mask before reporters, Schliemann declared, "I have gazed upon the face of Agamemnon." The phrase electrified Europe. Newspapers printed drawings of the mask, scholars debated its authenticity, and the world rediscovered a civilization long forgotten. Today, archaeologists know the mask predates Agamemnon by several centuries, but its power remains. It symbolizes the rebirth of Mycenae in human memory after 3,000 years of silence. Schliemann uncovered more treasures: gold cups, bronze weapons, jewelry inlaid with amber and ivory. He found massive gates carved with lions, palace, walls decorated with frescoes, storerooms where ancient scribes once pressed symbols into clay tablets. The tablets themselves, written in a script called Linear B, remained unreadable for decades. Only in 1952 did Michael Ventris, a British architect and codebreaker, decipher them. To the surprise of many, the tablets recorded not poetry or myth, but mundane lists, grain rations, sheep counts, offerings to gods. The Mycenaeans, it seemed, were as much bureaucrats as warriors. Yet even in their dry records, the tablets revealed something profound. The Mycenaeans spoke an early form of Greek. They were not strangers to the later classical Greeks, but their distant ancestors. Through archaeology and linguistics, a picture slowly emerged. A Bronze Age world of palaces and chariots, of trade with Egypt and the Hittites, of kings who ruled over fortified cities connected by roads still visible today, but mysteries remain. Why did the palaces burn? Who were the sea peoples who raided the Mediterranean at the same time Mycenae fell? Did earthquakes topple their walls? Did rebellion rise among their subjects? Or was it some combination of all these disasters at once? Archaeology gives clues, but no final answer. The collapse of the Bronze Age remains one of history's great puzzles, a reminder that even advanced civilizations can vanish, leaving behind only ruins and riddles. And so the story of Mycenae bridges to worlds, the world of history uncovered by spades and translated from clay tablets, and the world of myth, sung by poets for centuries before writing returned to Greece. It is hard to say where one ends and the other begins. Did Agamemnon truly walk the halls of Mycenae? Did Achilles sail for Troy? Or were they born in the imaginations of bards weaving fragments of memory into tales of wrath and glory? What we know for certain is this: the Mycenaeans were real. Their cities, their treasures, their writing, their sudden falls, these belong to history. Yet through Homer, they also belong to legend, larger than life, half-lit by the fires of poetry. In the next and final part, we will follow how this mixture of history and myth shaped the identity of Greece itself, inspiring philosophers, artists, and even modern archaeologists to keep seeking the truth beneath the earth. Because Mycenae's story did not end with its fall. It began again each time someone asked, "What happened here?" The hills of Mycenae are quiet now. Olive trees sway where kings once ruled. The wind slips through the Lion Gate, no longer guarded by soldiers with spears. Tourists wander among the ruins, snapping photographs where palaces stood 3,000 years ago, but as the sun sets over the Argolide plain, casting long shadows across the stones, it is easy to imagine the world that came before. Somewhere beneath the earth lie the remnants of golden masks and bronze swords, of chariots and clay, tablets of dreams both broken and fulfilled. Somewhere in these hills, a voice still seems to whisper not in words, but in the silent persistence of stone. Remember us. The story of Mycenae is more than the tale of one city. It is the story of human ambition, triumph, and fragility. A people who rose from scattered villages to build walls so massive they seemed the work of giants. who mastered trade across the Aegean, negotiated with kings in Egypt and Anatolia, sent ships across wind-dark seas, and inspired poets for millennia. And yet, like so many civilizations before and after they fell, no enemy recorded their names. No chronicler described their last battles. They left behind no kings to boast of victories or mourn defeats. Their voices fell silent, their writing forgotten, their palaces left to crumble under sun and rain. But centuries later, others came, searching. Archaeologists with shovels, linguists with codes, poets with words. They all followed the faint trail left by the Mycenaeans, piecing together a story scattered across time. And in doing so, they discovered something profound. Civilizations vanish, languages die, empires rise and fall. But human curiosity endures. Our need to understand the past, to connect with those who came before us, never fades. Every mask unearthed, every wall uncovered, every tablet deciphered is a conversation across the ages. A way for the dead to speak again, if only in fragments. Today, the Mycenaeans belong partly to history, partly to myth. Scholars analyze their economy, architecture, and warfare. Tourists walk through their ruins. Children read simplified versions of the Iliad in schools, often unaware that real people, real kings, and real cities once inspired those tales. But perhaps the line between fact and legend does not matter as much as we think, because stories are how we survive time. The Mycenaeans built walls of stone, yet it was stories that carried their memory through the centuries of darkness. Without Homer singing of Achilles and Agamemnon, would Schliemann have searched for Troy and Mycenae? Without those legends, would archaeologists have cared enough to dig through the dust? Mycenae teaches us that glory fades, but meaning remains. The people who once lit fires on these hills, who prayed to gods whose names still echo in later Greek religion, who farmed the land and sailed the seas, they lived lives as real as ours. They loved, fought, hoped, and feared. Their world ended, but through history and myth, we meet them again. And we are reminded that our own civilizations, no matter how powerful, are not immune to time. One day, the cities we build might crumble. Languages we speak might vanish. Yet perhaps someone, centuries from now, will dig through our ruins and wonder who we were, what we believed, how we lived and died. The story of Mycenae is not just about the past. It is about the present and the future too, because history is a mirror. When we look at Mycenae, we see human ambition reaching for greatness. We see fragility beneath the surface of power. We see how myths preserve what memory forgets. And we see the unbroken chain of curiosity linking us to people who lived 3,000 years ago. As night falls over the ruins, the stars appear bright points of light over hills once ruled by kings. The same stars the Mycenaeans saw when they stood on their palace walls. The same stars sailors followed across the Aegean. The same stars poets invoked when they sang of wrath, love, and homecoming. Civilizations rise and fall, but the sky remains, and perhaps, in that unchanging dome, above us, the Mycenaeans are not entirely gone. Their walls have fallen, but their stories endure in Homer's verses, in Schliemann's discoveries, in every traveler who walks through the Lion Gate and feels the weight of time pressing close. The Mycenaeans once asked the gods to remember them. Now it is we who do. Their echo travels through centuries, whispering from ruins and gold masks, from broken tablets and shattered walls, from legend and history intertwined. And as long as someone listens, As long as someone tells their story, Mycenae lives. Thank you for joining me on this journey through history. This has been the Bedtime Historian, where the past comes alive to guide you into rest. If you enjoyed tonight's story, please like, share, and subscribe for more calming tales of history. Until next time, sleep well and good night.